Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, adapters. Welcome back to another episode of America Adapts. This is such a fantastic episode. How could it not be? It's about climate change and surfing. The guest this episode is Chad Nelsen, CEO of the world-famous coastal conservation group, Surfrider Foundation. We dig into topics such as institutionalizing adaptation, sea level rise in surfing, grassroots advocacy, and much more. Before we get started, just some very important housekeeping. Thanks to Beth Gibbons, Managing Director at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, for the nice plug of America Adapts in their newsletter. You've heard me talk about ASAP before. It's the only professional society focusing on adaptation, and it's a huge and growing field. Look them up and join their growing network of adaptation professionals. I have links in the show notes. Hey, adapters, it is the end of the year, and all of you are now desperately looking for organizations to donate to. December is traditionally the biggest month for giving, so please consider supporting America Adapts. We have all come a long way, and we've done it through the support of listeners. Please consider giving a tax-deductible donation. And tell your friends if they're looking for a good group to give to, they can give to America Adapts. You can find links to the Flip Cause donate page in the show notes, and to those who are already donating and recurring donators, thank you. Also, if you're interested in sponsoring a specific podcast or having me speak at public or corporate events, please contact me via the website americaadapts.org. Okay, upcoming guests. I have an economist from the real estate company Zillow coming on to discuss sea level rise work they are doing. I'm loving that Zillow is starting to think about climate change. Then I have Professor Elizabeth Rush from Brown University coming on to share her thoughts on nonfiction writing and climate change. And I'm currently hard at work on a sponsored episode by the World Wildlife Fund focusing on snow leopards and adaptation. I'm literally talking to people from all over the world for this one. And my second annual holiday special should be out soon, where I have some surprise guests come on to discuss what happened this year in climate change news, and also to talk about the future of this podcast. Okay, I know how this works. You want me to start this thing. Okay, let's catch an adaptation wave with Chad. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Here's Chad. Welcome back, adapters. We have a very exciting episode for you on today's podcast. I have Dr. Chad Nelsen, Chief Executive Officer of the Surfrider Foundation. Welcome to the podcast, Chad.
Hey, thanks for having me, Doug.
Well, it's great to have you on, and we were actually trying to record this in person last week. I was out there in Los Angeles for this Landscape Architects Conference, and then we had set up a time and everything, but I poorly planned, not realizing how sprawling Southern California is, and I thought, oh, I just pop in and see you, and it doesn't work that way, does it?
No, well, it's 50 miles, but it can take 3 hours, depending on the time of day that you want to make that commute, so...
Apparently, even if you're 5 miles away from anything in LA, you have to build in 45 minutes, they tell you. So, yeah.
It's true.
Well, on that note, I'm here. We're doing it on Skype, and so I regret, but I will make a point. I think I'm going to try to get out to California next year, and hopefully I'd be able to pop in and maybe we do some sort of follow-up, but I definitely want to get out to where you're at, so that's my goal.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
All right, so you are at Surfrider Foundation. You are the CEO. Let's just give my listeners some basic background first. What is Surfrider Foundation?
Sure. We're a grassroots coastal and ocean conservation organization. The Surfrider Foundation was founded in 1984 in Malibu at Surfrider Beach. And it was really a group of visionary surfers who sort of were tired of seeing the ocean and their surf spots impacted and decided to take action. At the time, and I guess still today, surfers sort of suffer a bad reputation as being sort of dropouts and losers and people who aren't contributing to society. And these guys wanted to change that, and it was somewhat selfish at the start because they were trying to protect surf spots. And since then, it's grown. We have 80 all-volunteer grassroots chapters around the nation. We're in almost every coastal state except for a couple in the Gulf, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And we work on a variety of coastal issues that are local, state, and federal in nature. Water quality, beach access, coastal development, offshore, ocean protection in different ways, and plastic pollution.
Okay, so do you actually surf?
I do. I surf. I try to surf 2 or 3 days a week.
Nice.
So yeah, and avid surfers, I did a bunch of research, which we can talk about or not, but on sort of surfers and economics and surf behavior. And the average surfer that I interviewed, which were thousands of them, were about 100 days a year. So they're surfing like people run.
Well, as an aside, who put us in touch in the first place is Randy Olson, the science communicator, who's been on my podcast multiple times. And so when I was visiting him out in LA, he was checking the surf report on his, phone like every hour. And I guess that's a common theme with you guys. You're planning things out 2-3 weeks, deciding when the swell is coming in and all that. So.
Yeah, well, and it's actually relevant to Surfrider's mission because surfers, like a lot of, I guess, sort of naturalist recreational activities like fly fishing or other things, are really students of the ocean and students of weather. They're looking at these forecasts. They're watching storms brewing off of New Zealand that are sending swell across the Pacific, in our case. They're looking at the direction of those waves, the wave height, the wave period. Then they're comparing that to, the orientation of the coast and tides, and then looking at weather and wind. And so it's actually, they're really amateur meteorologists and oceanographers, which makes them great sort of coastal advocates because they already understand the sort of the science of the coast in many ways, on top of, decades of observation. So
Randy was correcting me on all my terminology related to surfing, and it was all wrong. So I found that quite humorous. But this is not a surfing podcast, but it's about Surfrider Foundation. And there's a couple things I want to accomplish with this conversation. And one is that you guys are a unique organization, and that partly is tied to your history, is related to surfing. But then this podcast is about climate change, and I want to talk a bit about your emphasis on climate change and how you guys are evolving to address that issue. But I'm just going to dig in a bit more about the organization itself and kind of put you on the spot and see how you kind of answer this question. But
sure,
what do you think are the 3 greatest achievements of Surfrider? And I think that gives listeners a good sense of the things that, you mentioned earlier, but what do you think are the 3 greatest achievements?
Great question. We won in the early 90s. Surfrider Foundation won the second largest Clean Water Act lawsuit in the nation against a pulp mill in Humboldt in Northern California that was polluting the ocean and a surf spot, and it was a huge victory for the organization, and it really put us on the map. So it was a pivot. It was a big victory in its own right, and an extraordinary victory for a small organization. It really kind of was a turning point in terms of our growth and our success. So that's certainly one of them. We also have recently stopped a massive 6-lane private toll road at Trestles in San Onofre State Beach, sort of right in our backyard here in San Clemente, that was going to sort of decimate the last healthy watershed in Southern California, destroy a state park, and impact arguably some of the best surfing areas in the United States. At Trestles, it's the only surf spot in the U.S. that regularly hosts one of the world championship tours, which is sort of the elite surf contests of the globe. So that's another one. And I think the third I would say is our victory to ban single-use plastic bags in California last November. It was one of the positive outcomes of the November election. And it was a ballot initiative in the state of California that banned single-use plastic bags statewide. That's significant for a couple of reasons. One, Californians use about 15 billion or used about 15 billion of those plastic bags every year. So those are taken out of circulation, and they are a very commonly found item of trash on the beach. And it's the first state to do so. So we're hoping it's going to set a precedent to help reduce plastic pollution nationwide.
Well, congratulations. Those are pretty, I guess, monumental for you guys. It's quite an accomplishment for, I guess, an organization that actually isn't that old. This next question, I'm very curious how you might answer this. Is Surfrider an environmental group built around a sport, or is it a sports group that has a strong environmental agenda?
Every year we do a strategic plan, that question comes up. It's very clearly an environmental group that is trying to use ocean recreation as a vehicle to get people involved. So at the end of the day, our mission is the protection and enjoyment of the world's ocean waves and beaches. And, we're really, really focused on conservation efforts, and we're trying to get surfers and other people who recreate on the ocean and the coast engaged. Another part of that is, you don't need to be a surfer to be involved in Surfrider. We hear that all the time, and, it's a strong part of our culture and it's part of our history, but we have an amazing network of activists who aren't surfers who are still participating in coastal conservation.
So do you actively try to recruit? I'm assuming you have like a membership model for the organization. Like if you want to donate, I guess you're almost a de facto member. Do you like try to recruit people in, central United States? Do you have Kansas members? Is that even something that you try to do?
We have members in every state in the U.S.
Oh, okay.
We don't, most of our activity takes place on the coasts where, we're kind of a local grassroots organization. Our membership is, mostly coastal, but, the beach is the number one visitor destination in the United States. And so there's a lot of people who spend their week-long vacation at some beach in the U.S., and we hope that they can support the local community in the place they like to visit. So we're not actually out there targeting, the demographics of Kansas necessarily, but we know we have members out there, and maybe they go to the beach in San Diego every year, and so they want to support us so they can make sure the water's clean when they go on their holiday.
So you've talked a little bit about it, but could maybe give some more examples. How does Surfrider, I guess, vary on issues region by region? So California has very specific issues, and you have chapters all over the place. So can you give a few examples? I know you have, I think 80 chapters or something. Not looking for 80 examples.
80 chapters, every coastal state. So I can give you a ton of examples. And, one of the things that's sort of unique about the Surfrider Foundation that I really like is, on one hand, we have 80 local organizations. So, I can give you an example. Driving on the beach is sort of sacrilege in Southern California. The only people who can drive on the beach here are the lifeguards. And so, issues around driving on the beach, if you looked at those in California, would be very different than Texas, where driving on the beach is seen as a fundamental right. There's a lot of places on the coast you can't get to in Texas unless you drive on the beach. And driving on the beach in Texas is actually like a fundamental part of their coastal and beach access sort of cultural history and laws. So we let the local chapters sort of determine their positions on issue that are in context with their, local laws, their history, their heritage, their culture, and sort of what's relevant and makes sense for them. And that varies, what you can do on a rural or a sort of an empty rural beach in Oregon is different than you can do on Miami Beach. And we really, let the locals drive the positions. We do have sort of commonality across some issues, shoreline armoring, which is something we'll talk about, where it tends to be the same. At the same time, we can organize those 80 chapters nationally and kind of act like a national organization if we can come together around an issue and work there. So I think we have the best of both worlds. We can kind of operate on a national scale and at the same time zoom down to the local level and really operate at the local level.
So I grew up in Florida on the beach in Sarasota, but obviously went to beaches all over the state, and you can't really drive on the beaches in most of Florida, but I went to Daytona Beach, and they allowed you, at least at the time, to drive, and it was just the worst experience of my life. You're laying there, and 2 feet from your feet is a big car just driving by. It was surreal. I think it was the first time I encountered driving on the beach, and I'm like, this is nuts. But yeah, like you said, it's a local issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are places I know on the Outer Banks and where you literally, there's no roads. Mm-hmm. So if you want to get out to some of these, at least for the surfers, you want to get out to some of these surf spots, unless you're willing to hike 8 miles, you actually have to drive on the beach to get there. And my guess is there's few enough people doing it that it doesn't have a huge impact, although driving on the beach clearly does have some environmental impact.
I lived in Australia for a few years, and you're right. Literally, the only way to get around some of those remote islands is like the beaches are the highways, so that's how they got around. So I want to pivot to Surfrider Foundation's focus on climate change and its role on your organization, and I think other groups could probably learn a lot. And I know you guys have started to really focus on this issue. And you did an interview when you first got hired as CEO, because you've been with Surfrider for quite a while, but I think, how long have you been CEO?
Yep. I've been CEO for 3 years, but I've been with Surfrider for almost 20.
Okay. This interview, you know what I'm talking about. It's on the website. And so I want to read something here. And so you identified 3 priorities in this interview as coming on as CEO. And the first one here is to address the impacts of climate change on our oceans and coasts, such as ocean acidification and sea level rise. I believe this will be the biggest challenge we face in the next 30 years. And so that's one of the 3 points. And I'm just curious, how are you addressing those issues right now?
Sure. I think if I tell you how we used to address them and how we're trying to address them, it'll tell that story. Surfrider Foundation, for one thing, is one of the very few national groups that actually focus on coastal issues, coastal development, shoreline armoring, sea level rise now, beach, nourishment, quote unquote. And we've been working on those issues since the very beginning of our organization. For 33 years, we've been fighting shoreline armoring projects and, which is a response to coastal erosion, regardless of the origin of that coastal erosion. And, when infrastructure that humans build is threatened, one of the responses is to armor the coast with riprap or seawalls or revetments, which we know impact the beaches. And so we've been fighting those projects, project by project by project, dozens and dozens of them around the country for 30 years. And so it was a very reactive, very localized approach, and if you win one of those campaigns, which we often did, you stop the shoreline armoring project for some time. If you lose one, that part of the coast is impacted for the rest of time. They pretty rarely get taken out. So that was our sort of place, local, spot by spot, project by project reactive approach for 30 years. And it's not a winning strategy, because if you win, you delay it. And if you lose, it's forever. And so one of the things we've tried to do over the last 3 years is pivot and try to actually get in front of these problems and use land use planning and coastal adaptation planning to try to, anticipate these future problems and focus on plans to adapt to the coast. And, that might mean that in some places the coast is sacrificial and we armor the coast. In some places that might mean we want to protect recreational beaches and we use, very expensive and ecologically damaging sort of beach refill projects. And in some places we're going to have to retreat. But do that in that comprehensive, proactive, planned way instead of just waiting for problems and reacting to them. So that's been the big shift for us over the last 3 years. We're still fighting shoreline armoring projects, but we're also trying to be local advocates for coastal adaptation and planning and either get involved in those if they're happening or try to promote that kind of thinking in places where it's not happening yet.
Another one of your priorities is that you want to, I guess, go away from being reactive to proactive, and I think how you address issues. And what you just described, I think a lot of coastal issues, it is reactive, and I think the issue of climate change is forcing a lot of organizations to be proactive. And so in a way, it's a priority that I think links very well to your emphasis on climate change. And so what I kind of want to dig into, and I think other groups could benefit from your experiences, you've dealt with these issues on sort of case-by-case basis, but how are you institutionalizing climate change or adaptation, or are you? I mean, are you getting the board involved? Have you done a strategic plan? Because a lot of groups out there, I mean, there's just, you know what I'm talking about. All of a sudden they'll have one staff member that'll start going to the climate change meetings, and it's sort of a haphazard approach. And have you been able to kind of step back and really institutionalize it?
I would say we are on the path to institutionalizing it. We haven't really arrived at that. And so, we've been developing a plan. We have we work on like 5 initiatives. We have a coastal conservation initiative. And inside that, we're talking, which is where we deal with these coastal erosion, armoring, nourishment type issues, inappropriate coastal development. So we've been developing a plan inside that initiative to address sort of the coastal adaptation piece. We're also doing some work on ocean acidification on that side of it too. And so for us, because we have this, grassroots network, it's at the end of the day, it's really about training our chapter network on sort of ways to get involved. They know how to fight a seawall or a shoreline armoring project because we've been doing that for years. And, we're trying to educate them on the alternative, which is to try to get involved in planning. And that's hard to do with an activist organization. The metaphor that I use all the time is, if you live in your hometown and somebody's going to come in and plan a 12-story multi sort of tower condo complex in the center of your quaint little town, and they have a planning commission meeting, the community will come out with their pitchforks and their posters and fight that. If you have the 2020, 2050 visioning meeting at your city hall, the 6 sort of planning wonks in your town will show up. So it's much easier to get people to respond to the bulldozers on the beach and the rocks being poured down on the beach and fight the armoring project than it is to get them to get involved in the 2040 coastal adaptation planning. But we're trying to, educate people on the efficacy of that, give them the tools and resources to be effective stewards, and the science. And the good news is our sort of activist base and our members are already pretty educated on these issues. So they already understand sea level rise. They already understand the impacts of coastal development and coastal armoring. So it's getting them to pivot into thinking about planning. So we're to answer your question, we're sort of on that path. I don't think we're there yet.
This idea of institutionalizing adaptation planning, it's a tricky one, and I've spent a lot of time looking at that. But I guess one way of doing that is who you recruit to your board. And I didn't look at your board members, but I actually just had a conversation with one of your board members who's probably going to come on the podcast. I don't know if she ever chatted with you, Margaret Peloso.
Maggie Peloso, yeah.
Maggie, okay.
Yes. You know her as Margaret.
That's her email says. But I had coffee with her last week. She had reached out and she just wrote a book on sea level rise. And so we're probably going to get her on. But just by coincidence, I brought that I was going to talk to you up, and she's like, wait, I'm on the board for that. So did you ever chat with her?
I did. I had a brief chat with her about that. She said she had met you. I mean, she's extraordinary in many regards, both in terms of, she sort of simultaneously got her PhD at Duke and her law degree at Stanford, which kind of says enough, and focused on these really important coastal issues. And, she has a really important perspective because I think, as I said to her, these planning processes, as I see them, they usually start with some sort of like hazard or risk assessment, which is a science project to say, how is our coast going to be impacted by different scenarios of climate change? And then the next phase is some sort of planning phase where people look at their alternatives over time and what can be done to sort of minimize impacts and what the trade-offs are, and then at some point the rubber hits the road and we actually have to tell somebody that they have to change or move, or that they can't do something they want to do, like build their dream house on their coastal property right up against the edge so they can have that whitewater view from their kitchen. And that's when usually things get ugly. And, it inevitably leads to lawsuits and issues around takings. And, that's really in many ways, her expertise. And so I feel like her perspective is great at all levels, but particularly in this really sort of when we get pragmatic about like, what do these things mean and what are the impacts?
Yeah, she's sort of one of these people that I wonder how they even retrieve information from their brain. Just incredibly, like she's got the PhD and a law degree from different coasts, and I'm just like, I can barely quote Simpsons very well, and she's out there doing that. But I guess my point is back to the point of institutionalizing. Did you recruit her as a board member, or does she kind of go before you when you came on as the CEO?
Well, we actually had, she was on the board before I got hired. So arguably she recruited me, but, it was here, but she actually was recruited to our board from another Margaret, or Meg, I should say, Meg Caldwell. It is another Margaret, who, now is at the Packard Foundation, but ran Stanford's sort of legal environmental clinic and is also a incredibly knowledgeable, sort of academic mind when it comes to these coastal issues, and law. So we've benefited from having a number of people. So she recruited her student at the time, and now, Maggie to our board. So we've actually had a pretty long history of having some really sort of nationally recognized coastal policy and legal experts on our board over my tenure here, which does make a difference. So we maybe haven't institutionalized sort of coastal adaptation specifically, but we've always wanted to have sort of coastal conservation, science, law, and policy representation on our board, which can apply to a number of topics, including coastal adaptation.
Oh man, you've got some ringers on that board, a foundation person, Margaret's just this expert on sea level rise. Well done. Well, and again, the point is that she can, when you have those internal conversations, I imagine she can weigh in a very educated way on, because you look at the coast that you're dealing with, and this is, I kind of want to pivot to, like, there's probably been a lot of focus on California, even though you have chapters everywhere, but sea level rise issues in Florida are going to be much different in a lot of ways to California. And so how do you kind of set policy as an organization? Because, in Florida, I've had a lot of guests on from Florida. That's where I'm from. I used to work there. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about losing these areas. And I know California will lose some areas, but the difference between Florida, it's pretty dramatic. Miami, in all likelihood, could be gone with 3-4 feet of sea level rise. And so how do your chapters there, if you guys come together, even on the issue of sea level rise, there must be kind of like, well, okay, it's just a completely different beast. How do you kind of bring in, have that common ground? Yeah,
I think, on a principle standpoint, our organization and our 80 chapters and our staff, we agree that, hey, climate change is real, being caused by human, causing sea level rise. We know those ranges are whatever they are, the minimum to the maximum, whether it's, 1.5 feet or 6 feet of sea level rise is going to have a dramatic impact on our coast because we're already seeing those changes day in and day out right now. We know shoreline armoring harms beaches. We know beach fill or beach nourishment, which is a euphemism for it, is expensive, marginally effective, and forever. And that retreat is really the only long-term sustainable solution. So we kind of have this set of principles that we all sort of agree upon, and then we sort of apply those to the local context. So I was just down in Miami working with our chapter down there, and I was on a panel at a conference about climate change with the mayor of Miami Beach and meeting with our chapter, and not only is the geography different, and it's, flat and porous, the political climate's also vastly different. So you can't go into Tallahassee and talk about climate change and coastal adaptation. You have to talk about flooding and extreme weather. So I think that's another advantage of sort of this model we have is you can, if you sent some of our California policy people into Tallahassee, I don't think they'd be very effective because they'd be using the wrong language. So, the challenges are massive. So we agree at principles on a federal level, on a national level, and then we apply those principles within the local context.
Well, Florida's bonkers. I think there's a term for, and I grew up there, I can call it bonkers, but they call sea level rise flooding. I think even in some of the official policy statements, like nuisance flooding or something like ridiculous. But what's crazy is, you went down there to Miami, and the local governments are just raging on this issue, and it's really encouraging. And then the universities. And so when state people go to meetings, it must be embarrassing because everyone else is like moving at the speed of light. And so it really is bonkers how they're approaching it.
Absolutely. I think that ideology gives way to pragmatism at the local level. So, if you're the mayor of Miami Beach and you're watching storm drains flood backwards into neighborhoods instead of drain water to the ocean, and you're watching, high tides, sort of regular high tides flood streets, these are the pothole issues of sort of sea level rise and climate change. So they have to address them. So, that's where the pragmatism comes in. And, whether or not you agree with the approaches they're taking, they have to be taking them. Whereas if you're sitting in Tallahassee, you're like, oh, this is a theoretical construct, and I don't want to believe it because it gets in the way of my donor funding base or whatever it is. But so I think that's really interesting. Is when you look at the local level, the reality hits you in the face.
I guess digging deeper in the sea level rise issue for you, your organization, it fascinates me in a lot of ways because sea level rise is this charismatic megafauna of climate impacts. And again, you have to approach it different ways on different coastlines. Even, in the Great Lakes, there's different ways of looking at it. And what a lot of groups struggle with, and I hope Surfrider, if you're not doing it already, it's something you're headed towards, is how do you define success when it comes to sea level rise? Because there's so much negative around it. It's like, well, we're going to have to retreat. We're going to have to abandon these areas. And that's in reality in Florida, that's going to be the case. But on a yearly basis, on defining metrics as an organization, what do you consider victories in the realm of sea level rise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think for us, we'd probably put it in 2 or 3 boxes. One would be, successful defense against these shoreline armoring projects. So, the reactive response is wait for the problem and throw rocks in the way and sacrifice the beach for some temporary benefit to the coastal property, which, we see all over, Florida included. So it's stopping those kind of projects from happening, because if you stop them, then you get a minute to say, okay, well, what are we going to do? And you can shift that conversation. So that's one metric, is just, we're tracking how many of these seawall campaigns we have out there and or armoring campaigns and whether or not we're winning them or losing them. On the proactive side, it's, how many good coastal adaptation plans can we positively impact and get passed? So in California, for example, they have these local coastal plans that are regulated by the California Coastal Commission, which has put out a sea level guidance document so that these local plans have to incorporate sea level rise, and we're trying to get in there and be advocates for that adaptation. And so, if we can see good local coastal plans passed, that's going to be another indicator of success for us. On the flip side, if we watch Laws Weekend post-storm, if we watch armoring projects go in, we've lost a couple of those. There's a horrific project. These are all small in scale, but they add up is the problem. In the downtown Montauk area out on sort of eastern Long Island, they put in a giant mile-long geotextile seawall to try to stop erosion. So we see those losses, and when we lose, we try to turn that around and turn it into a learning experience, because when people armor the coast, it doesn't take very long before you see the negative impacts.
Well, I'm sure you get involved with educational efforts with the public, and I'm just curious, maybe there's something like this already, and this is kind of a surfing question, but have you seen anything where you sort of, 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise, what does this mean for famous surf breaks? And is there something out there like that? Can you kind of communicate, you're going to lose your favorite surfing spots?
Yes. There is actually. There's actually a guy named Dan Reineman who did his PhD dissertation on that at Stanford.
Wow.
Amazingly enough, he looked at the impacts of sea level rise in different scenarios along the coast of California and how it was going to impact surfing spots. And so when at the end of the day, the wave breaking is controlled by the depth of the water. So as waves come in, when they reach a depth that's approximately half their height, they break. Depending on what the shoreline looks like, if it's a reef, a rocky reef, or a coral reef, a lot of surf spots are very tide dependent, which is why surfers are always studying the tides. And so the quality of the wave, or whether they're surfable or not, or even break, can be impacted by the tide. And here in California, we have at the maximum about a 8-foot tide range. And it's normally, a 3 to 4 to 5 foot tide range kind of. And that has a huge impact on the quality of surf spots. There are some surf spots that I surf that are unsurfable at low tide because the rocks are exposed, or don't break at high tide because the water's too deep to trip the wave. So surfing is incredibly sensitive to tide. So if you increase, we call it permanent high tide. If you increase the sea level by 3 feet to 6 feet, you're going to be in this sort of permanent high tide. And there will be surf spots that will disappear entirely, and this guy, Dan Reinemann's estimate was that half the surf spots in California will be impacted in some way by that. Now, could some new ones emerge? But it probably won't be an even trade-off, particularly because if we armor the coast in response to all the sea level rise and we lose our beaches, it's going to be our response to that sea level rise is going to have a huge impact on surfing and our ability to go to the beach as well.
Surfers, they value those breaks, and if that happens, there's that cultural history that'll be lost too. That's probably not focused on as much. But, there's a lot of like history tied in with those breaks. So, yeah, a lot of stories.
Yeah, it's a huge economic driver. I mean, the surf industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Beach tourism in California is a $15 billion industry, and there's some decent percentage of that it has to do with surfing. And like you're saying, it's sort of an iconic, sort of part of the identity of a lot of these coastal communities in California and Florida and elsewhere. So it could, surfing sounds trivial in the grand scheme of climate issues for sure, but it probably will have a real economic impact if that happens. We also think, like there was this group called Protect Our Winters put out some amazing report about the impact of climate change on skiing in the United States of America. And I think it was a way of making these climate change issues real to people. Obama actually in his last State of the Union address made this reference to sort of losing skiing in America. And it just kind of showed that finding these things like surfing or skiing that people can wrap their head around and talk about the impact is maybe a way of bringing awareness to people in a way that's different from a lot of the technical, confusing discussions about climate change. Even sea level rise, as simple as it is something that's hard for sort of, I think, the average person who's not sort of living on the coast to understand.
Well, have you ever seen any visual educational tools that my last guest, we talked about how sea level rise is going to cause sort of the migration of people. He did a model and had like 14 million people. Mm-hmm. And we were sort of joking that everyone very casually says, oh, well, I'll have beachfront property and they're in Orlando or something. And like, most of the sea level rise maps that we see, they're these bathtub models be like, oh, look, Miami's flooded up until this point, but it's just very like, there's the line. And have you ever seen...
Yeah, it's like a lake, right? Yeah.
But have you ever seen any visuals that it's not going to be beachfront? It's going to be marshy, muddy goo, and there's going to be all sorts of former gas station toxic fun sites that are going to be now underwater. And so...
Yeah, it's going to be a wasteland.
But have you seen any like visual tools out there that sort of explain, no, the beautiful beach is just not going to migrate really nicely with sea level rise? Have you ever seen it? I haven't. I'm trying to think.
No, and it's funny because I've seen a lot of those visualizations that you're talking about, and you're right. The water's like placid. It is the bathtub. It's just a lake. Like I've seen those visualizations of Manhattan underwater, and it's just it looks like Venice, right? Just the buildings with popping out of the water, and you're like, oh, we'll just have water taxis. It'll be fine. Right. But it won't. You're right. It'll be sort of apocalyptic, and I haven't seen that. Interesting quick aside, I actually just went and watched the Blade Runner 2049 last weekend. And, one of the things that was extraordinary is it takes place in Los Angeles, and there's a scene that takes place on the coast, and there's like a 50 or 100 foot metal seawall lining the coast of Los Angeles. And I had to give the movie makers credit because they kind of, without saying anything about it, kind of anticipated this world where we're disconnected from the ocean by some giant wall. But that was the reason I bring it up is because that was sort of an apocalyptic view of the coast of the future, which isn't this placid flooding, but some horrifyingly giant wall separating us from the ocean.
Right. It's just the idea, even as it moves up slowly, it's just like, it's not going to be these quartz sand beaches that kind of naturally emerge or they're on the edge. It's going to be just the Louisiana coast probably, where it's just this muddy breaking apart, and that I don't think that's given enough attention. Hey, there you go, Surfrider. There's a tool you could use.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because one of our sort of early mentors and, continues to be at Surfrider is, Orrin Pilkey, the infamous coastal geologist from North Carolina at Duke, and he was one of the people who's credited with understanding sort of how coasts migrate with sea level rise. Because if you look at the barrier islands over time on the East Coast, they kind of move up and down the coast with sea level rise. And, he was credited with showing how they migrate, and every time they overwash, they're kind of pushing themselves back and they can move around and they're mobile. And, obviously we're trying to make them stationary, which is part of the problem. They're built to move. Part of that is an indication that if we actually stayed out of the way, and assuming sea level rise doesn't accelerate so quickly that those processes can't keep up, my guess is they would adjust. We could have wide sandy beaches with sea level rise. It's the fact that we that we try to stop that natural process from occurring. And, you can see this all over the coastlines. There are areas where you can see shoreline armoring and there's no beach, and adjacent to it is natural coastline, and it's, the coast has moved in 50 feet, but there's still a wide sandy beach there. I think it's really, as one of our activists in New York so eloquently said, he's like, coastal erosion isn't the problem. Coastal erosion is actually beautiful. It's what's created these landscapes, these coastlines that we love. It's our interference with those natural processes that causes all the problems. I thought that was really sort of insightful, because we're like, ooh, coastal erosion bad, which is really not true unless we get in the way. Then it's a big problem.
Well, I think there was an article in the Rolling Stone about Miami. I think it did the best job of sort of, through text, visualizing what this flooding might mean for the city and sort of the abandonment. And there weren't really the visuals, but just the description. And it's just like, yeah, that's how we have to dig into that. We have to capture people's imaginations over what the implications this means, especially with all this built environment next to the coast.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, that's when you quoted that statement that I made in that, that blog, that interview, sea levels, I know this is on average and it varies depending on all these factors in different regions, but it's risen 8 inches or so in the last 100 years in the U.S. And as Surfrider is a group that's like on these beaches and these coastlines all around the country for the last 30 of those 100 years, you can see the challenges and problems it's created. I mean, there's miles and miles of the Florida shoreline that are armored and the beaches are suffering, and same is true in California and other places. And you think about 3 feet to 6 feet of sea level rise in the next 50 to 75 years. And the scale of that impact compared to what we're already seeing is really hard to wrap your head around. And I think we're woefully unprepared to deal with those consequences. And, one of the big questions I have, and this is a classic Randy Olson shifting baselines thing, is, if this is a slow moving disaster, is it finally going to accelerate to the point where it's quickly enough moving that we actually start to feel it and need to respond, instead of just waiting for hurricanes and other natural disasters? But I think the scale of that impact of that 3 feet of sea level rise is just going to be mind blowing. And it's hard for me to believe we're anywhere near ready for that, from a planning standpoint, from a sort of legal standpoint, from a financial standpoint.
Well, it's interesting how different sectors approach sea level rise. And when I was at the Landscape Architect Conference, I think it's a field that's still getting their head around the issue. Some of the landscape architects are very sophisticated. They get it. Others as a field are still picking up and separating it out from sustainability. But what I was encouraged to see is, I think a lot of people that are really doing adaptation work, they're very cautious. And so you say the 3 feet of sea level rise, which is a kind of a number we hear from the IPCC, but more people are getting comfortable saying 4 or 5. And like one of the
yeah, I'm being conservative. Yeah.
One of the presentations I saw was sort of, as they were showing some, the development, they put in 12 feet. And it was just very interesting to see how this field, this landscape architecture field it was anything goes on sea level rise. And I think it's good. You need to think really sort of outside the box, whereas a lot of people that are dealing with sea level rise on a day-to-day basis, they're naturally gravitating toward the most conservative number, which 3 feet, I think in 5 years, we're going to look back, quaintly on 3 feet.
Well, I think so too. And it's interesting. Two things I've noticed. One is that every time the IPCC comes out with a prediction, they increase the prediction. So they were like, we were too conservative. So there's a trend for them to keep upping their predictions. The other graph that I find really interesting is if you look at some of the early sea level rise predictions, they have like the sort of megaphone graph where there's this range where there's a low level and a high level, and there's this range in between that increases over time. And then you track what's actually happening with sea level, and it's it's amazingly accurate, but it's on the maximum line trend, So if that continues, it suggests that the maximum estimates are more accurate than the conservative estimates.
Well, I hope groups like yours keep pushing the deeper end of that, just because, we need to have this conversation. So, I mean, it's almost like a policy discussion you internally have to kind of get behind, because it weighs in on, if you go and talk to local governments, you can't be so different from what they're talking about, but at the same time need to be pushing them to think 5 feet might be the reasonable number now.
Yep. Well, and again, kind of circling back to Surfrider, that's really where our strength is we can educate these locals. They really do know the coastlines in their communities better than just about anybody else there because they're on them every day. In many cases, they've been around for a while, so they've observed changes, and they can go advocate at the local level as, really experts on these topics and push city councils and local and regional governments to take action. And, at the end of the day, that's often where the rubber meets the road with these decisions. And so that's what we're trying to do and, arm our membership base with the facts and the information and the tools and best practices and, good examples at adaptation planning and get them out there advocating for those things. And so, while it's really important for groups to be pushing this issue on every level, that's our niche.
Well, Chad, we've been talking for quite a while. I actually have a few more questions that wrap this up relatively soon, but I think everyone wants to kind of know this is why is California such a leader on all things climate change? Do you have some insight to that?
That is a great question. I think there's obviously sort of larger progressive politics in California. I mean, California seems to be bucking a lot of the national trends when it comes to progressive politics broadly, including climate. I think we've benefited from, a Republican and a Democratic governor who have prioritized the issue, Schwarzenegger and now Brown. And so I think that has really benefited the state. And I actually believe that the environmental community in California has had a huge role, so that the NGOs that have been pushing these issues in Sacramento and elsewhere have done a great job. Sorry for the dog barking in the background. We got a dog-friendly office.
That sounds about right, but yeah, go on.
So I think those are some of the reasons. It's interesting because, I think from a coastal perspective, we're not seeing the impacts that Florida's having. These wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, I think were a real eye-opener, like all of these, weather and individual, disasters don't equal climate change, but we're seeing these trends. So I don't think it's been the personal experience of people. I think it's sort of their politics and, great groups advocating for change.
A lot of groups, I think, are struggling to kind of separate out how they address climate change. There's the mitigation side and carbon emissions and clean energy, and then there's the adaptation side. And yeah, some of them kind of mix the two. And when I was out in California, obviously I wasn't throughout the whole state, but I was encouraged that it seemed like adaptation was really kind of stepping out and coming to its own. San Francisco's doing some really amazing things, and people can speak the language, and you're speaking the language, and your organization, I mean, just even from how you describe what you want to focus on, is ramping things up. And so, yeah, I love seeing that separation of the two, because sometimes when people say, oh, we're dealing with climate change, we're changing our light bulbs and driving Priuses.
It's emissions, right? I mean, and it's funny because we get asked that all the time too. I mean, we've made a very strategic decision. I probably should have answered this at the front end when you asked us about our strategy. We're not well equipped to deal with the emissions issues because we're really this relatively small coastal focused organization. So, solar in the desert is something I can't really speak to, or the trade-offs between natural gas and other things. So we've really decided, hey, of course we understand that we need to reduce emissions and there's human causes to climate change, but we're really going to focus on the impacts of climate change on the coast.
And there's so many people in the mitigation side of things too. And I worked in the state of Florida, and they wanted us to kind of do both, but I worked for a state wildlife agency. And so the focus really needed to be on adaptation. That was sort of like the core business that the agency was involved in. Other people are going to do emissions better. And you're seeing some conservation groups kind of, especially with the Paris Agreement, it's my understanding the Nature Conservancy is really just kind of decided they want to get into the emissions game, which I just find this odd decision. They have this long history with land protection, and adaptation seems to align with their mission so much. And there's just other groups who are doing the emission side of things. You know what? I mean, not that TNC can't help, but it seemed like a weird pivot to the people that I talked to is like, yeah, we're going all in. Our state chapters are going to focus in on it. And I think some conservation and environmental groups are struggling with this identity in the climate change era. And, I really do hope they recognize what their sort of core missions are.
Yeah, I mean, and that might be a response to sort of the Trump administration and Pruitt's sort of abandonment of these things. And they're like, okay, we got to weigh in on that, which, we all do. But, yeah, I agree. I mean, the other thing we talk about is, there's a lag time, obviously, between the carbon we pump into the atmosphere and the impacts, the warming impacts. And, the ocean has a ton of inertia. It's big. And, so we're going to see if we cut all our emissions tomorrow, we've still got 100 years of sea level rise and impacts that we're going to have to address. So, for us, we're like, these are the things that we really need to do.
I don't think people appreciate that adaptation is actually a skill set, and it's something you have to recruit into your organization. And it's just, there are conscious decisions on how to get better in that side of things. So.
Absolutely.
All right, a couple more questions here. I generally ask folks for some questions to ask my guest on occasion, and I got this one that isn't related to adaptation so much, but I said I would do it. And this is related to surfing, and you're a surfer. Do you have any recommendations for great surfing-themed books?
Yes, of course. Without question, I think the best surfing book ever written is called The Barbarian Days. It was written by a guy named William Finnegan, who is a war correspondent and New Yorker author. So he knows how to write. He had one of the most extraordinary global, multi-decadal global surf adventures that any surfer could have. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for the book.
Okay, good one. Any others real quickly?
So, there's another one called, there's an author whose his first name's escaping me. His last name's, K-E-M Nunn. He wrote a book called Tijuana Slews. It's a great fiction piece about surfing. And then another really good author is a guy named Daniel Duane. He's sort of a New York Times writer. And he wrote a book that I believe is called Caught Inside. Those would be my 3 recommendations.
Okay, sorry to put the spot on that, but I thought it might be a useful question for some people.
Absolutely. You got to start with Barbarian Days.
Okay.
It's so good.
This will make sure that he listens to the end. And have you heard of the genre of cli-fi? Have you heard of that?
No, but I can guess what it is.
Right. Climate science fiction. I actually had an art critic on who that's her specialty is like reviewing climate science fiction, Amy Brady. And so it occurred to me that, there's got to be that next great cli-fi surf book out there someone needs to write, get some more attention on the issue. So.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, and, Blade Runner 2049 started to dabble in it.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So my last question is a question I ask all my guests. And if you could recommend any future guest, and preferably someone that maybe you could help make a connection with, who would you recommend that I talk to?
From a coastal adaptation perspective.
Or anything related to adaptation.
Adaptation. Yes. I've got a couple. There's a group of folks down at Scripps who we're partnered with. They have a surfboard fin called Smart Fin, and they're trying to build a surfboard fin that can measure ocean acidification in the coastal zone through surfers.
Awesome.
Trying to turn surfers into citizen science so we can understand, adapt, and mitigate to the impacts of ocean acidification along our coastlines. That would be one. And I don't know, have you interviewed the mayor of Miami Beach?
No.
I was on this panel with him about a month ago, and I was really fascinated by him because, they're doing these, raising the roads and doing these different things, which may or may not be long-term solutions, but they're happening. He's a pretty amazing, dynamic guy, and he's doing this in a state that's very politically different to do it. So I think he would be a fascinating interview.
And do you have links to both of them?
Yep. I'm happy to introduce you to both.
Oh, awesome. Those are great. Those would be great future guests. Randy and I are mainly me trying to plot any way to get Arnold Schwarzenegger on the podcast. And, that's a biggie, but, do you have any
tell him that if he, Muscle Beach in Venice, which is where he got to start, is going to disappear when it's flooded by sea level rise. And so he's got to get down there and talk about the issue before we lose that iconic spot that started his whole career.
I've heard him talk on climate change. Like you said, he's been involved as governor. I mean, the man can talk about climate change in great detail. So yeah.
One other one that you would be interesting to is Gavin Newsom.
Oh yeah. The climatologist, right?
No, he's lieutenant governor of California.
I can't think of someone else.
Maybe there's a scientist one too, but he's a rising star in California politics. I met him because he was a big advocate of renewable ocean energy, which is fascinating. San Francisco has actually a really progressive, I should have talked about it, coastal adaptation plan for their coastline that's really good in the city. And, he was former mayor there. And so I think he would have a really interesting perspective kind of from local to state to global.
No, that'd be awesome. I haven't had a politician on just because sometimes, it is the kind of conversations you want to dig into. So, but that would be great to have someone from California.
His knowledge on renewable ocean energy was extraordinary. I was really impressed. He understood the nuances of it in a way that I didn't expect for someone sort of flying at his level of politics.
Great. Well, before we wrap this up, any sort of final message you want to get out there about Surfrider Foundation or anything else?
No, thanks for having me. We're a all volunteer driven organization. So if these coastal issues are something you're passionate about in your part of the world, odds are there's a Surfrider chapter working on them, and we encourage you to get involved.
Thanks so much for coming on, Chad. This was a pleasure. I hope I actually get you on again at some future date. Again, I'm hoping to get out to California next year, and maybe we could come up with an on-location theme for a podcast. But again, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'd love to do that. There's some great stories to be told up and down the California coast that are so relevant to this topic. So I'd love to do that. Thank you.
All right, great. All right, adapters, until next time, this is America Adapts. Okay, adapters, that is a wrap to this episode. Thanks to Dr. Chad Nelsen from Surfrider for coming on the podcast. That was a fun conversation. Chad is such a great guy. You can tell his heart is really in the work that he's doing, and it's such important work. I expect as sea level rise becomes a dominating issue in the years ahead, groups like Surfrider Foundation will be looked to as innovators in the field. Some final housekeeping. Last month, I was invited to present at the Nerd Night at the DC9 bar. Basically, this group invites science speakers to come on stage and to talk science in front of science-curious millennials. It was a blast. You're on stage, people standing in front of you with drinks in hand, and I got to talk adaptation. It was actually a great challenge to make the topic come alive, but it actually wasn't that hard. I just told stories of previous guests, and they loved it. Thanks to Aaron Huertas for inviting me on. Don't forget to join the Facebook page and the Facebook community group. The group is private, but just search for America Adapts and ask to join, and I'll approve you right away. It's a chance to hear insider info on the podcast and to see what other listeners are sharing on that wall. Some great conversations have come out of that group. Also, I love hearing from you, and I mean it. Just say hi. If you have an idea for a guest, let me know. Seriously, it's the highlight of my week hearing from you, and sometimes it leads to really cool things. I'm at americaadapts@gmail.com. Send me an email. Okay, check out the website at americaadapts.org. All this information is in my show notes, especially the link to that donate page. It's the end of the year, and I know there are long-time listeners who are just itching to donate. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.